Don't conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. From time to time, people ask me, how do I become a Christian? Well, I think that's a legitimate question, all right, but I think it's not the question Jesus would have us ask. He would far prefer the question, how do I become a Christian? You know, there's a world of difference between the two. In the gospel lesson this morning, we came across the story of the rich young ruler. This man wanted to know how to connect with God, and after death, he wanted to be looked after by God, to be acceptable to God. Jesus gave a thoroughly Jewish answer. Keep the 10 Commandments, and you're in. Let's remember that the 10 Commandments are the greatest foundational statements of principles, of obligations to keep and injuries to avoid. There's no terser statement or more important summary of these principles anywhere in world literature than these 10 commands. Thus, one commentary says the 10 Commandments concern matters of fundamental importance in both Judaism and Christianity. The greatest obligation is to worship only God. The greatest injury to a person to avoid is murder. The greatest injury to family bonds to avoid is adultery. The greatest injury to commerce and law, bearing false witness or lying in order to deceive and profit by it, the greatest intergenerational obligation to keep is to honor one's parents. The greatest obligation to community is being truthful. The greatest injury to property is theft. You know, many of my friends in the U.S. are very disturbed about the direction that their country is taking. Ironically, in Louisiana, a Republican-controlled legislature and governor have made the study of the Bible part of curriculum and is placing the 10 Commandments in public places and in schools. Now, why am I saying this is ironic? Because bearing false witness has become a political strategy embraced by the Republican Party. They're all sworn to the lie that the election was stolen. The Supreme Court decision on partisan lines offends the 10 Commands, allowing the president to be immune from criminal prosecution in the line of official acts. So the president may bear false witness and get away with it. Well, this results in a deliberate undermining of the principles found in the great 10 Commands. And when that happens, there's nearly always a slide that goes on towards dictatorship or anarchy or war. On a personal level, the injuries listed in the 10 Commands destroy personal relationships. But if you keep these commands, says Jesus, you're going to inherit eternal life. The young man wants to be very sure, and so he asks, I've kept all of these, what more do I need to do? And Jesus said, if you want to be perfect, go and sell what you own and give your money to the poor and come and follow me. And the young man can't do it. And he goes away sad because he was very rich. Yeah, this young man is in, but when the challenge of sacrifice comes, he bails. You know, many people bail when they're asked to sacrifice. A little later, the scribes and Pharisees and doctors of the law want Jesus to say, which of the 10 Commands is the greatest? And Jesus answers them, love the Lord with all your heart, your mind, and your strength. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like unto it, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. On this hangs all the law and the prophets. But then he gets asked, who's my neighbor? And Jesus talks about a good Samaritan. And let's remember that Jews had no dealings with Samaritans in the same way that Israelis and Palestinians are two separate solitudes. The Samaritans were enemies to Jews, and Jesus, bless his huge heart, uses a Samaritan to teach his Jewish audience they need to love their enemies. You know, it's quite true that Christianity is not a walk in the park. It involves an obligation to love difficult people. A lot of us fail here and bail by withdrawal from relationship. We just stay away from people we choose to find difficult. After the resurrection takes place, Peter's asked to speak with a Roman centurion who asks what he needs to do to please God. And Peter makes a summary. I've come to understand that the person who does what is right in any nation is acceptable to God. In other words, you don't have to be Jewish to keep the 10 Commands and have peace before God. Centurion was a good, moral, godly pagan. St. Paul teaches the same thing. He says that God has no favorites. St. Paul, as a Jew, believed in the 10 Commandments and was quintessentially Jewish. But at first, he had not learned who his neighbor was because he was persecuting and having Christians arrested, jailed, and of course eventually killed. So he had much to answer for in his deep religious zeal. But because he was part of the power structure, he was immune from prosecution. Like many radicals today, he was killing in the name of God. But following an encounter with Jesus on the Damascus Road, St. Paul converted to Christianity, became its greatest apostle, founding the Christian church in the Gentile world. Now, the change in Paul was deep and profound. When asked, how do we become a Christian? St. Paul was to say, if you shall confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, believe that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. Or in other words, you're in. But then he spent the rest of his life teaching what it meant to be Christian in our behavior. There's something else I think we need to notice, just to answer the question, how do we become Christian? You see, Jesus takes the 10 Commandments and he tightens them. He's not interested in the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law. And the young man who has kept the 10 has omitted the first, which is not to have any other God before God. You see, money is this man's substitute for God. In other words, he is in actuality breaking the first command because he worships an idol before God. Money is first for him. So what Jesus does is asks him to get rid of his idol, give to the poor, and then follow him. So it's not just the 10 Commands, is it? It's suddenly gotten much harder. He does the same thing when asked, who is my neighbor? And goes out of his way to illustrate that the enemy has to become neighbor. You know, this is very tough stuff to follow, especially when someone from a different tribe has hurt you. When asked about not committing adultery, Jesus makes that tougher. He says it's not just keeping away from the physical act, it's avoiding even thinking about it. So don't think that being Christian is easy. It is not. And that's why Deepak Chopra argues that Christianity is too hard for the average person to live by. He says only saints can keep such a high standard. In the time of the Protestant Reformation, when Protestantism and Catholicism were fighting each other, there was a major argument. The Catholics argued you can only get into heaven by good works. Luther and John Knox argued that by grace are we saved through faith, lest any person should boast about their good works justifying them. So was Christianity too hard to keep for Luther and Knox? Was it only for saints? Should we lower standards, cut off the top of the mountain, so at least all of us can get halfway up? And that's where the doctrine of grace became so important. Jesus taught that the prodigal son, who completely screwed up, is forgiven when he returns home to relationship with his father. His father loves him by grace. The elder brother, however, is in demerit pay, and as far as he's concerned, the prodigal has got a negative balance. The father extends unmerited favor to the prodigal. He loves him, wants him back no matter what. That is what God is really like, says Jesus. So let me summarize Jesus on how to be Christian. Commit yourself to loving the Lord your God with all of your heart, your mind, and your strength, and your neighbor in the same way you love yourself. Jesus says this is the summary of all the law and the prophets. We had Micah read beautifully this morning. Prophet Micah said, "What does the Lord require of thee but to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God?" And when we do not, we can seek forgiveness. And God, who is aware of our hearts and looks on them, loves us by grace alone. So we can keep the high standard as something to strive for and throw ourselves on a grace so great that it takes our breath away as we fall into the loving arms of God. Now, some people who are born into a Christian family are going to find being truly Christian to be second nature. Others who have wandered far away will have to hit rock bottom and then perhaps have a conversion experience like that of St. Paul, or the prodigal who came to his senses. They'll return home to a belief in God, ask for forgiveness, and will receive a royal welcome. Then once connected to God, they go out and live a joyous, selfless life for other people, guided by the man from Galilee who lived his life for others and so found joy. So what's it all about when we work it out? Loving God, loving the neighbor, which includes the enemy, and loving your own self. That's what it means to be a devout Jew, a devout Christian, a devout Muslim, or a devout God-seeker anywhere, for God has no favorites, but the person in any nation who does what is right is acceptable to him. You see, Jesus is not interested in card-carrying Christians. He's into transformation. You ever notice that people become kinder around Christmas? As the song puts it, Christmas is a feeling filling the air. It's love and joy and laughter of people everywhere. It's a baby in a manger on a cold winter's night. It's the spirit of giving in you and in me. For Christmas is a feeling filling the air. It's love and joy and laughter of people everywhere. But if Christmas is a feeling bringing such good cheer, then why, oh why, don't you and I try to make it last all year? It was at Christmas that Ebenezer Scrooge became transformed into a warm, caring human being from being a greedy, old, selfish man. He became Christian. He experienced a change of heart. George Mapson from Westminster, BC, talks about his change of heart that began as a small boy. It was at the age of 11 when the change took place. 5 years before, his father had died through drowning. His father had no pension, no benefits. This was the time of the Great Depression, and his poor mother had to make do with very little. George and the rest of the children had to make do with cardboard in their shoes every day because their shoes had no soles. Their main diet was what they called French toast, which was fried bread in lard. The house rent was $25 a month, and his mother took the social assistance check of $25 to pay the rent at Christmas time, or they'd be evicted on January the 1st. George, sick of his footwear, decided to save up $25 to get himself a new pair of boots. He wanted the very best, with no cardboard for soles. Had his eye on Pierre Paris boots, which cost $23. The big day for getting his boots finally arrived on the afternoon of Christmas Eve, and he walked to the bus some half-mile to go get them. But on his way, he noticed all the homes had Christmas lights and decorations up. He then realized that his home had no lights, no decorations, no turkey or ham dinner, and all they'd get for Christmas would be French toast. He was only 11 years old. He began to experience a sense of guilt. Here he was, going to buy himself a new pair of boots while his mother was at home in tears, thinking of ways to explain why the children had no presents. Got to the bus stop, decided not to get on the bus. The bus drove off without him. He'd made his mind up what to do, and suddenly an enormous burden was lifted from his youngest shoulders. A large grocery store was opposite the bus stop, a Piggly Wiggly. Into the store he went, brimming with happiness and excitement. He realized that the $25 he'd worked so hard for went a long way. He bought a turkey, a ham, oranges, all the Christmas trimmings. He spent every dime of his hard-earned money. The store owner sent him home with his loot on the bicycle carriers of 2 delivery boys who put it all on the front porch of the house against the front door. When George arrived and knocked on the front door, when his mother opened the door, some of the loot fell inside. She stood there absolutely dumbfounded, holding back all his tears. George hollered, "Merry Christmas, Mother! There really is a Santa Claus!" 11 years old. He only had a lot of explaining to do as he packed away the groceries. He said that day he got enough hugs and kisses from his mother to last him a lifetime. You see, his mother had been praying, and to see her prayers answered more than made up for the loss of his Pierre Paris boots. George had experienced what Jesus taught. He experienced a transformation, still available to us all, whether we're card-carrying Christians or not. He moved away from thinking that it was all about him into truly living for others. And then he discovered that he was brimming with happiness and excitement. He was all in. 2,000 years ago, that's what Jesus wanted for that rich young ruler. But the rich young ruler wanted his Pierre Paris boots. Where was the real sadness? This young man had missed the greatest and richest meanings of life. He'd missed all the brimming excitement and happiness of being there for other people. Let us then be transformed by the renewing of our minds and so find heaven on earth and each other and God.